You can't hear it at first, not with human ears. It's so low it slips under the edge of our hearing, more vibration than sound, like distant thunder you feel in your chest before your brain admits it's real. Out on the savannah, an elephant stops. Not the whole group, just one. Her head lifts slightly, her ears angle forward like dishes turning toward a signal. Her trunk rises, not dramatic, just enough to taste the air and read the world. And then something happens that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. In a loose cluster of elephants, adults and calves spread out, moving, grazing, touching. Only one individual reacts. Not the herd, not every calf, just one. She turns toward a point far away. She answers, and she begins to move, directly, like she knows the call was meant for her. If you're watching, it looks almost ordinary, like any animal responding to a sound. But if you pause and really think about what you're seeing, it becomes strange. Because in human life, there's a difference between hearing a sound and being addressed. A crowd can hear a shout, but only you respond when you hear your name. For as long as humans have told stories, we've imagined a particular kind of miracle. That animals are talking to each other in ways we could understand if we only had the key. We built myths around it. We built children's books around it. We built movies around it. We invented characters like Dr. Doolittle, the human who could talk to animals as easily as we talk to each other. And for a long time, we treated that idea like a fantasy, because the more we tried to force animals into human conversation, the more complicated it got. But something has shifted. Not because elephants suddenly became smarter, because we finally got better at listening. In recent research, scientists have presented evidence that wild African elephants sometimes direct individually specific calls toward one another, calls that function like vocal labels, not words, not sentences, not translations, but something closer to the idea of addressing a particular individual. The internet compresses that into one irresistible phrase. Elephants have names for each other, and if you're like most people, your first reaction is to smile, your second reaction is to doubt it, and your third reaction, if you sit with it long enough, is to realize something bigger is hiding behind the headline. Because if elephants can address one another as individuals, that changes how we see elephant intelligence. And if we can detect that now, when we couldn't prove it before, that says something about a new era of science, an era where artificial intelligence is helping us notice patterns too subtle, too complex, and too vast for human senses alone. This isn't a story about talking to elephants like Dr. Doolittle. It's a story about how our old dream was too small, because the real breakthrough isn't that animals become like us. It's that we finally recognize them as themselves. So in this first part, I want to do something simple. I want to build the elephant world in your mind, not as a list of facts, as a lived reality. Because the idea of names, name-like calls, only makes sense in a world where individuals matter over time. And elephants live in a world built on long time. Elephants can live for decades, often 60 years or more. That is long enough for a life to have chapters, long enough for relationships to become history, long enough for calves to grow into adults while the same matriarch still walks at the front, older, heavier, calmer, carrying memory like a library. And elephant society isn't a crowd, it's a network. Families are built around older females, often grandmothers, who lead not through force, but through memory. They don't lead because they are the biggest or the most aggressive. They lead because they remember where water was during a drought years ago, which routes are safe when conditions change, which parts of a landscape turn dangerous under pressure, which other elephant families live nearby. And this matters because elephants don't just move through space, they move through memory. An elephant landscape is not simply a place, it's a map of seasons, a map of danger, a map of reunion points. And in that map, other elephants aren't interchangeable, they are known individuals. Elephants raise calves together. A calf is not raised by a mother alone. Aunts and sisters and older siblings are involved. There is touch and correction and play and protection. Calves learn how to be elephants by living inside elephant society. They learn what is safe by watching how older females react. They learn what is dangerous by watching how older females tighten the group, change direction, go silent, or move with sudden purpose. And elephant society is not static. This is crucial. Elephants often live in what scientists call a fission-fusion system, meaning groups can split and reunite over time. A family might spread out to forage, subgroups might drift, then later they come back together. That means elephants are constantly solving a social problem that humans rarely think about. How do you stay connected in a world where you can't always see the ones who matter most? How does a mother find a calf that wandered too far? How does a group coordinate movement when visibility is limited? How do you reunite after separation? How do you call one individual in a world where sound carries and everyone might hear you? This is where the elephant voice becomes extraordinary. Elephants use a range of vocalizations, but among the most important are deep rumbles, low-frequency calls that can travel across long distances. Some of these rumbles can be so low that humans may not clearly hear them, but elephants can detect them. And it's not only hearing. Elephants can also be sensitive to vibrations, signals moving through ground and air. So while you and I stand in the world imagining reality is what we see and what we hear, elephants live inside a richer channel, one that includes low frequencies and vibrations that connect individuals across space. If you've ever felt the bass at a concert before you recognize the melody, you have a small hint of what it can feel like when sound becomes physical. Now imagine that physical sound is not music, it's family, it's safety, it's identity. And here's the part that matters for our story. Elephant calls aren't just noise. They carry information. They can coordinate movement. They can maintain contact. They can signal emotional states. And elephants can recognize individuals by voice. But for years, researchers noticed something that didn't fit neatly into the idea of broadcast calls. Sometimes an elephant would call, and the whole group would respond. And sometimes an elephant would call, and only one individual would respond. One, and that is different, because a broadcast call is like saying, "Hey everyone," an address is like saying, "You." And in human life, we built an entire tool for that. We built names. So the question became unavoidable. Could elephants be doing something functionally similar, using sound to target specific individuals? For a long time, humans were not in a position to answer that question well, and to understand why, we have to talk about the Dr. Doolittle dream, because it shaped the way we listened. Humans love the idea of talking to animals because it makes the world feel less lonely. It makes nature feel like a conversation that includes us. And there's something beautiful about that desire. But there's also a trap, because the moment we decide animals should speak like us, we begin to misunderstand them. We tried to teach animals our systems. We taught parrots words. We taught apes signs. We listened to dolphins and looked for sentences. Sometimes those experiments revealed real intelligence and real learning, but they also revealed how easy it is for humans to project. If a parrot says a word, is it naming an object or repeating a sound that brings attention? If an animal performs a behavior, is it understanding or is it training? If a call happens in a certain context, is it a word or is it an emotional signal that correlates with that context? The Dr. Doolittle fantasy encouraged a simple expectation that animal communication would be obviously meaningful in the way human language is. But animal communication is not built for human minds, it's built for animal lives. Different senses, different priorities, different structures, and elephants in particular live in a world where much of the important signal can be low frequency, subtle, and embedded in relationships. That means a human standing near elephants can hear a rumble and think, "Sounds the same," while an elephant hears it and thinks, "That's her," or "That's my calf," or "That's for me." For decades, researchers faced a stubborn limitation. They could record elephant calls, they could observe elephant behavior, but proving something as bold as name-like addressing required more than observation. It required a way to detect consistent patterns across many calls, patterns that might be too subtle for human ears to reliably track. Because humans can listen to one clip and make a guess, but we can't listen to thousands of clips and consistently detect a tiny acoustic difference that correlates with who the call is directed toward. And that's the moment where our story turns. Because the biggest limitation wasn't elephant intelligence, it was human perception. And now, for the first time, we have tools that can extend perception. Artificial intelligence didn't arrive as a magical translator, it arrived as a relentless listener, a pattern finder. A system that can compare thousands of calls, measure subtle differences, and ask a new kind of question. Is there structure here that we've been missing? That's where this new era begins. But before we go there, I want you to hold on to one image, because it's the emotional spine of everything that follows. An elephant hears a call you can't hear, and from a group of many, only one responds. If that response is random, the moment is ordinary. But if that response is targeted, if the elephant recognizes herself as the one being addressed, then the moment becomes a doorway into a different understanding of elephant minds. And that changes how we see everything else. Because names, name-like labels, are not just sounds. They are social tools. They only exist where individuals matter, where relationships persist, where memory is long, where a community needs a way to reach a specific someone across time and space, and elephants live inside exactly that kind of world. So here's the promise I'm making to you as we move into the next section. We are not going to turn elephants into humans. We're not going to pretend we have translations. We're not going to do the lazy internet thing where every impressive animal behavior becomes proof they're basically people. Instead, we're going to do something more respectful. We're going to follow the evidence. We're going to look at why this names discovery is so significant. And we're going to see why AI is part of the story, not as magic, but as a new kind of ear that helps science meet the complexity that was always there. Because what's happening now is bigger than elephants. It's a shift in how humans understand intelligence. For centuries, we treated our senses as the boundary of what exists. If we couldn't hear it, it didn't matter. If we couldn't see the pattern wasn't real. But the world has never been limited by what humans can perceive. We were. And now, that boundary is moving. So when people ask, do elephants really have names for each other? The deeper answer is, we finally have a way to test whether elephant communication can target individuals. We finally have tools that can help us detect structure hidden in sound. And once we detect structure, we can ask better questions and learn more without pretending we've decoded an elephant dictionary. That's the new dream. Not Dr. Doolittle, not fantasy conversation, but something more honest and more hopeful. A future where humans become better listeners. Because a world that listens is a world that protects. And the first step in protection is recognition. Recognizing that elephants are not just bodies moving through a landscape. They are networks of individuals. They are memory. They are relationship. They are society. And perhaps, if the evidence continues to hold, there are moments when one elephant calls across distance and another hears not just a sound, but herself being addressed. And now we're ready for the turning point. Because in the next part, we meet the new ear, the tool that doesn't get tired, the tool that can listen longer than any human, the tool that helped turn a beautiful suspicion into measurable evidence, artificial intelligence. And the moment it entered this story, everything we thought we couldn't know began to change. And the moment we introduce that new ear, everything changes. Because for most of human history, our understanding of animal communication has been limited by a simple fact. We can only notice what our senses can reliably detect. If an elephant call is too low for us to hear clearly, we miss it. If the difference between two calls is subtle, our ears blur it together. If meaning is embedded in tiny shifts across many acoustic features at once, we can't hold that complexity in our heads long enough to compare it across hundreds or thousands of examples. For decades, that limitation shaped the story we told ourselves. Either animal communication was simple, instinctual, emotional noise, or it was mysterious, and we filled that mystery with human imagination. The Dr. Doolittle fantasy lived right there in the gap between what animals were doing and what we could prove. But then, quietly, science gained a new kind of listener, not a translator, not a mind reader, a listener. Artificial intelligence, in this context, is best understood as something very specific, a system that can detect patterns in large amounts of data. It can listen to enormous libraries of sound. It can measure what changes and what stays consistent. It can compare thousands of calls and ask, do these cluster into types? Do they differ by context? Do they differ by who is involved? Do they differ in ways humans don't reliably notice? This is not magic. It doesn't start by knowing what anything means. It starts the way a careful scientist starts, by refusing to assume and by paying attention to structure. Think about what that allows. Instead of relying on a human ear to say, this sounds like it's for that elephant, you can ask a model to examine the acoustic features of calls and see whether patterns consistently correlate with who the call appears to be directed toward. Instead of a handful of observations, you can scale up. Instead of, I think, you can move toward we measured. That shift from intuition to testable structure is what makes this era different. You can see similar approaches emerging across animal communication research. Not because AI is a fad, but because sound is one of the last huge data sets in nature that humans have been collecting for decades without fully knowing how to interpret its scale. But we have to keep our expectations clean. AI does not automatically give meaning. AI does not automatically decode language. AI can generate hypotheses, strong guesses about structure, that humans then test with real-world experiments. And that's exactly what makes the elephant story so compelling. Because elephants were always telling us something. We just didn't have a way to measure it. For years, researchers observed that elephant calls seemed socially directed. You'd watch a mother call, and one calf would come running. You'd watch an adult female call, and a specific partner would respond. You'd see moments where the response looked targeted, not broadcast. But it looks targeted is not proof. It could be coincidence. It could be that one elephant just happened to be closest. It could be that the call was generic, but the response was socially shaped. So the question became, how do you prove that a call contains information about who it is meant for? This is where the 2024 research enters the story. A team of scientists studying wild African elephants analyzed their calls and asked a very direct question. Can you identify the intended receiver of a call from the call's acoustic structure? In other words, is there something in the call itself that points to who it's for? This is where AI-style pattern analysis becomes useful. Because if the signal is subtle, if it's not one obvious signature note, but rather a blend of tiny features, then human listening won't be enough. A model can measure many features at once, consistently, across a large dataset. The researchers used computational analysis to examine elephant calls and see whether the calls contained receiver-specific information. But the real turning point, the moment that lifts this from intriguing to extraordinary, does not happen on a computer. It happens in the field, because even if you can predict the receiver from the call, you still have to show that elephants themselves treat it that way. And the way to test that is elegant in its simplicity. You play the callback. You see who reacts. If a call is truly for a particular individual, you would expect that individual to respond differently when they hear it, compared to when they hear a call that was directed towards someone else. And that's what was found. Elephants responded more strongly when hearing calls that appeared to be directed at them, compared with calls directed at other individuals. Again, listen to the careful phrasing here. Not, we translated the call, not, we know what the name is, but elephants behave as if they recognize when a call is addressed to them. That is the heart of the names idea, because what makes a name function like a name isn't the sound itself, it's the social outcome. It's the fact that the sound targets an individual and the individual recognizes it. Now at this point in the story, it's tempting to rush, to jump straight from elephants respond differently to elephants have names exactly like humans. But that would be the old human mistake again, forcing animal communication into a human-shaped box. So let's slow down and be precise. When scientists talk about name-like calls or vocal labels, they're pointing to a concept, a signal that refers to a specific individual. Humans do this with names, but we're not claiming elephants have the full human naming system: first names, last names, nicknames, spelling, writing, legal documents. We're talking about something more fundamental, a learned label that points to you. And there's an additional detail from the research that makes the finding especially interesting. The evidence suggests these labels are not simply imitations of the receiver's own call. That's important because some animals use identity signals, signals that announce who is calling, like, "This is me." But addressing someone else is different. An identity signal is self-referential. A vocal label is other-referential. It's you. If elephants are using non-imitative labels, that suggests something more abstract than merely copying a sound. It suggests they can learn a sound pattern that refers to a specific individual, even if it doesn't simply mirror that individual's own vocal signature. That doesn't make elephants human, but it does place elephant communication in a rarer category, communication that appears to target individuals by reference. And that is one of the reasons scientists took this seriously. Because names, name-like labels, are not common in the animal world. They require a certain kind of mind, a mind that can track individuals over time, a society where individuals matter enough to need targeted address, a learning system capable of acquiring labels socially. Elephants already fit much of that profile: long-lived, socially complex, memory-driven, bonded across decades. So the idea that elephants could develop individual labels isn't random. It's a hypothesis that makes sense given elephant life. The breakthrough is that we now have evidence consistent with that hypothesis. And the reason we can detect it now, when it was so hard before, is because our analytical tools finally caught up to the subtlety and scale of animal communication. That's the deeper story. Not AI decoded elephants, but AI helped scientists detect structure that could be tested. Now, before we go further, I want to address something that often happens when people hear about animal communication and AI in the same sentence. They imagine an app. They imagine pressing a button and hearing a human voice say, "Hello, my name is." That is not where we are. And it may never be where we are, at least not in a simplistic way. Animal communication is not a clean code book like a language class. It's woven into behavior, context, emotion, relationship, and environment. Even in humans, meaning depends on context. In animals, context can be even more essential. So the honest way to tell this story, without hallucinating what science does not claim, is to keep the discovery grounded. Elephants appear to use calls that function as individually specific labels. Elephants respond differently when hearing calls that appear to be addressed to them, and the labels may not be mere imitation. Those are the key points. Everything beyond that is a frontier. And frontiers are exciting because they open questions. How are these labels learned? Are they invented by the caller? Are they shared by the group? Do calves acquire them from mothers and relatives? Do they change as individuals age? Are they stable across decades? Do different populations have different labeling conventions? And here's the most important part of why this matters right now. Those questions are now testable in ways they weren't before. Because the moment you can detect structure reliably, you can build long-term data sets and ask how that structure changes across time, context, and communities. That is how science moves from a single discovery to a deeper understanding. Now, I want to bring us back to our story's spine, the elephant who stopped and listened and moved. Because everything we've said so far can still feel abstract until you return to the lived moment. Picture it again: a wide landscape, families spread out, calves near mothers, adults grazing, walking, touching trunks, feeding. A low rumble arrives from far away. You can't hear it clearly, but the elephant does, and one individual reacts. If that reaction is because the call contains something that points to her, if it is a label, then we are witnessing identity being carried in sound. We are witnessing the kind of intelligence that doesn't show up as a trick. It shows up as social life. And now you can feel why the Dr. Doolittle fantasy is both understandable and outdated. Humans wanted animals to talk like us. But the real wonder is that animals are communicating in ways adapted to their own reality, often beyond our senses. And AI at its best is not making animals more human. It is making humans less blind, less limited, more capable of noticing what was always there. That's why this moment feels hopeful, because it suggests that many of our assumptions about animal minds were never about animals. They were about our limits. When we couldn't detect complexity, we assumed it wasn't there. But now we can detect more. And what we're detecting is humbling. Elephants are not just big mammals with emotions, they are societies with identity. And if they can address individuals, then elephant society is even more precise and relational than we have been able to prove. Now, here's a subtle but important shift I want you to notice. When people hear elephants have names, they often imagine it's just a fun fact about intelligence. But the real consequence is not intellectual, it's ethical. If elephants address individuals, then individuals matter in a deep way within elephant society. And that changes how we should think about loss, because loss is not just numbers. It is disruption inside a network of relationships. It is the absence of someone who was called, someone who answered, someone whose presence shaped the social world. And that brings us to the next part of the story, the heart of it. Because once you accept that elephants may be addressing one another as individuals, you can't unsee what that implies about their culture, their memory, and what happens when that fabric is torn. So, in the next section, we're going to move from discovery to meaning. We're going to talk about what name-like calls reveal about elephant minds, why this points to culture and social learning, and why the consequences of disruption, poaching, habitat fragmentation, conflict, are not just biological, they're social. And once you understand that, the story stops being cool science. It becomes a call for a more respectful relationship with life. Because if elephants can call each other as individuals, then the most honest way to describe them is no longer a herd, it's a community. And the moment you realize you're looking at a community, everything changes. Now we move from discovery to meaning, because once you accept that elephants may address one another as individuals, the question is no longer, is this interesting? The question becomes, what kind of mind and society makes this possible? And the answer takes us deep into elephant culture, memory, and loss. To understand why name-like calls matter, you have to let go of the idea that intelligence is something you measure with puzzles or tricks. Elephant intelligence does not show up as solving mazes or manipulating objects for novelty. It shows up as social intelligence, as the ability to live inside relationships that last decades, as the ability to remember individuals long after they are gone from sight, as the ability to manage a community where who is present, who is missing, and who is connected to whom matters every single day. Elephants live in societies where individuals are not interchangeable. A mother is not just an adult female. A matriarch is not just an older elephant. Each individual carries a role shaped by history. The matriarch, especially, is more than a leader. She is a living archive. She remembers where water was found during droughts that happened before the youngest elephants were born. She remembers which migration routes became deadly when humans moved in. She remembers which other elephant families are allies and which ones bring conflict. And that knowledge is not written down anywhere. It lives inside her, which means that elephant society depends on individual memory, not just instinct. Now think about what name-like calls fit into. In a society like this, communication isn't just about emotion, it's about coordination, safety, and continuity. If you lose track of who is who, the society breaks down. So the idea that elephants might use learned vocal labels to refer to individuals is not a quirky add-on to their intelligence. It fits perfectly into how their lives already work. Names, name-like labels, are not just linguistic ornaments. They are tools for managing complex social worlds. In human societies, we forget how fundamental names are because we grow up with them. But imagine trying to run a long-term community without a way to single out individuals. You couldn't teach, you couldn't warn, you couldn't coordinate, you couldn't grieve in the same way. Elephants appear to have solved this problem in their own way, not with written language, not with spoken words like ours, but with sound patterns that carry identity. And this is where the idea of culture becomes unavoidable. Culture does not mean art or music or cities. In biology, culture means something simpler and more powerful. It means information that is learned socially and passed through a group over time. Elephants show strong evidence of culture. Young elephants learn how to behave by watching older ones. They learn how to respond to danger by observing the matriarch's reactions. They learn migration routes not by instinct alone, but by following. They learn social norms, who to approach, who to avoid, when to move, when to wait. And if elephants use name-like calls, those calls must also be learned. A calf is not born knowing what sound refers to which individual. That knowledge has to be acquired, which means it has to be taught implicitly through repeated social experience. That is culture in action. Now, let's talk about something that people often sense intuitively about elephants, but struggle to articulate scientifically: grief and loss. For decades, people have reported elephants revisiting the bones of dead family members, touching skulls and tusks with their trunks, standing quietly near remains, returning to sites where deaths occurred. Some of these stories were exaggerated, some were romanticized, but long-term observation has confirmed something important and grounded. Elephants show persistent behavioral changes after loss. They do not simply move on, they search, they pause. They alter movement and social behavior when key individuals disappear. If elephants address one another as individuals, this makes sense in a new way. Because loss is not just the absence of a body, it is the absence of a voice that once addressed you, the absence of a sound that once carried identity, the absence of someone who responded when called. Imagine a social network where individuals are addressed directly. Now imagine removing one of those individuals. The disruption is not abstract, it's precise. The network changes. The calls that once elicited responses no longer do. The social map has to be rewritten. This is why poaching and habitat destruction do more than reduce elephant numbers. They fracture elephant societies. When a matriarch is killed, it's not simply the loss of an old animal, it's the loss of memory, the loss of leadership, the loss of accumulated knowledge that held the group together. Younger elephants may survive physically, but they are suddenly navigating the world without the social anchor that guided them. And if elephants use name-like calls, then that loss is also communicative. Calls that once reached someone no longer do. Responses that once came back are gone. Silence replaces recognition. This is where the ethical weight of the discovery begins to settle, because conservation has long focused on numbers. Population size, trends, statistics, those matter. But elephant life is not just a count. It's a community of relationships. And communities suffer differently than populations. They suffer through disruption, confusion, and fragmentation. Understanding this does not require turning elephants into humans. It requires respecting elephants, as social beings with their own form of identity. Now let's pause and address a crucial point. Nothing about this research claims that elephants have full human language. Nothing suggests grammar, syntax, or storytelling in the human sense. There is no elephant dictionary, no translation app. And this honesty matters, because overstating the claim weakens it. What the evidence supports is narrower and stronger. Elephants appear to use calls that function as individually targeted labels. They appear to recognize when a call is meant for them. That is enough to change how we think about their minds, because it places elephants among the rare species capable of referential communication. Communication that points to specific individuals rather than just broadcasting emotion or intent. and that ability is deeply tied to social intelligence. Now consider how this changes our understanding of elephant behavior we already knew about. Why do elephants show such strong bonds? Why do they recognize voices after years of separation? Why do they respond so intensely to loss? Why do disruptions in family structure lead to long-term instability? All of these behaviors make more sense if elephants live in a world where individuals are tracked, addressed, and remembered. The name's discovery doesn't add intelligence to elephants. It reveals the structure of intelligence they already had. And this is where the story connects back to artificial intelligence in a deeper way. AI did not invent elephant culture. AI did not invent elephant communication. AI did not upgrade elephants. AI simply allowed humans to detect structure that was previously invisible. And that distinction is critical because it reminds us that our understanding of other minds has always been constrained by our tools. When we couldn't see microbes, we thought disease was supernatural. When we couldn't detect electromagnetic waves, we thought radio communication was impossible. When we couldn't analyze massive sound data sets, we assumed animal communication was simpler than it is. History is full of moments where humans mistook the limits of perception for the limits of reality. This is another one of those moments, and it comes with responsibility. Because once you recognize that elephants live inside a socially precise world, you can't ethically treat them as interchangeable units. You can't justify destruction as easily. You can't ignore suffering as readily. You can't dismiss loss as just wildlife. This is why this discovery matters beyond science journals. It reshapes public imagination, and public imagination shapes policy. Now, let's step back again and connect this to the broader arc we've been building. The first part of this story showed you the elephant world and the mystery of targeted calls. The second part showed you how a new tool, AI, helped scientists detect structure and gather evidence. This third part is about meaning, what it means for elephant minds, what it means for elephant culture, what it means for loss, disruption, and ethics. And we're not finished yet, because there is a final turn in this story, a hopeful one. If listening can reveal this much about elephant societies, then listening can also become a form of protection. And that's where we go next, because once you realize sound carries identity, relationship, and social stability, you begin to see conservation differently, not as guarding numbers, but as safeguarding communities. And in the final part, we'll explore how this new way of listening, powered by AI, guided by restraint, and grounded in respect, could change how humans coexist with elephants and with other intelligent life on this planet. We're not at the end of the story. We're at the point where understanding turns into responsibility, and that is where the future begins. Once you see elephants as a community of known individuals, the future of this story changes. Because the discovery isn't only about what elephants are doing, it's about what humans can do with a new kind of listening. For most of modern history, conservation has relied on what we can see: aerial surveys, footprints, dung counts, camera traps, direct observation. Those methods are powerful, and they still matter. But they all share a limitation. They only detect what is visible, and often only after a situation is already changing. Sound is different. Sound is constant. Sound is a stream. Sound can travel through darkness, through brush, across distance. And for social animals, sound is not just noise in the background, it's the fabric of the community. Once you realize elephant calls may carry individually targeted labels, once you accept that elephant communication might contain you in sound, then sound becomes more than a curiosity, it becomes a kind of social data, and that is where the hopeful future begins. Because if AI can help scientists detect structure in elephant calls, patterns too subtle and complex for human perception alone, then AI can potentially help monitor elephant communities in a way that supports protection, not intrusion. Not by translating elephant speech into English, not by building a gimmicky Talk to Elephants app, but by doing something more practical and more respectful. detecting patterns that correlate with stress, disruption, separation, or instability, so that conservation can respond earlier and more intelligently. This is the new promise of listening. A world that listens can protect sooner. It can notice what eyes miss. It can recognize community health without needing to capture or disturb animals. And it can do that at scale, across landscapes that are too large for constant human presence. This matters because elephants live in places where human pressure is intense. Habitat shrinks, corridors are cut, conflict with people increases, and when elephants are threatened, the damage is not just physical, it's social. Communities fracture, family structures change. Younger elephants lose elders who carry memory. Stress ripples through relationships. If our conservation methods only measure bodies, we miss what matters most: the stability of the society. Listening offers a new window. Now, to keep this honest and grounded, we need to hold the line on what AI and listening can and cannot do. It cannot give us a perfect translation. It cannot tell us exactly what an elephant means the way a human dictionary does. And it must never become an excuse to anthropomorphize or sensationalize. But it can detect patterns, and patterns are the beginning of understanding. If certain types of calls increase in certain conditions, disturbance, separation, panic, those changes can become signals. If contact calling changes after disruption, that can become a clue. If the structure of calls that appear to address individuals shifts when communities are stressed, that can become a warning. This is how science often progresses, not with one magical leap, but with many careful steps, each one testable, each one building toward a clearer picture of what is happening. In other words, the hopeful future is not we talk to elephants. The hopeful future is we learn enough to protect elephants better. And that future is already taking shape in the broader world of animal communication research. Across species, researchers are building large data sets of sound and behavior and using computational tools to find structure that humans miss. Not because they expect to unlock a simple code, but because sound is one of the richest and least understood channels of animal life. That context matters for elephants because it means this discovery is not a one-off headline. It's part of a shift away from human-centered assumptions, away from the idea that only human-style language counts as meaningful communication, toward a more mature view that intelligence and communication come in many forms, that other species may encode identity, relationship, and social knowledge in ways we have barely begun to detect, and that the tools we build, if used ethically, can expand our perception beyond ourselves. Now, this is where we return one last time to Dr. Doolittle, because the Dr. Doolittle fantasy was never really about animals. It was about humans. It was about the comfort of imagining the natural world speaking in our terms. It was about placing us at the center of every conversation. And the truth is, that fantasy has always carried a subtle arrogance. It assumes that the highest form of communication is the one that resembles ours. It assumes animals are waiting for us to decode them, like puzzles created for human minds. But the new story, the honest story, is better. The new story says, animals were never waiting to become like us. We were the ones who needed to change. We needed to become better listeners. We needed to stop insisting that intelligence must look like a human mind to be real. And AI, at its best, becomes part of that transformation, not because it makes us masters of other species, but because it makes us more humble about what we cannot detect alone. It expands the boundary of what we can perceive, and when that boundary expands, the world becomes more alive, more complex, more intelligent. This is where the story becomes deeply hopeful, because the greatest threat to conservation has never been a lack of data. It's been a lack of recognition. People protect what they can emotionally recognize as real. They protect what they understand to have value beyond utility. And nothing builds recognition like a credible glimpse into another mind. If elephants can address each other as individuals, if they can carry identity and sound, then elephants are not simply a species we should protect because they're beautiful or iconic. They are communities of individuals who know one another, who remember, who respond, who lose, and who may call. That changes the moral landscape, not by guilt, by clarity, by seeing. And that moral clarity has practical consequences. It changes how people talk about elephants. It changes what schools teach. It changes what donors support. It changes what policymakers can justify. It changes what the public tolerates. That is how science becomes protection, not by forcing everyone to read a paper, but by reshaping what society believes is real. Now, let's address a final concern that comes with any story involving AI. There is a fear that AI makes things artificial, that it replaces nature with technology, that it turns animals into data points. That fear is valid if we use AI carelessly. But the best version of this future looks the opposite. It uses technology to bring humans back into relationship with the natural world, not a relationship of domination, a relationship of understanding. Because when you discover that other species may carry identity and sound, you don't feel like a conqueror. You feel humbled, you feel small, and you feel lucky to be alive on a planet that contains minds so different from ours and yet so undeniably real. So, what does a hopeful future actually look like? It looks like researchers continuing to study elephant calls with restraint, building evidence carefully, avoiding sensational claims, focusing on what can be tested. It looks like conservation teams using listening technologies to monitor habitats in ways that reduce disturbance and increase early warning. It looks like corridors being protected not only because elephants move through them, but because elephant communities depend on them for reunion and continuity. It looks like a public that is less willing to accept elephant loss as inevitable, less willing to treat elephants as scenery, more willing to recognize that when an elephant dies, a community changes, and it looks like humans gradually shifting their definition of intelligence, not as something that belongs to one species, but as something that exists in many forms across life. Now, before we end, I want to bring us back to the most important restraint in this entire story because restraint is what makes it credible. We are not claiming we can translate elephants. We are not claiming elephants have human language. We are not claiming we know what an elephant name sounds like in the way we know ours. We are saying something both narrower and more profound. There is evidence that elephants can address individuals with name-like vocal labels, and that elephants recognize when they are being addressed. That is enough. Enough to reshape how we see them, enough to reshape how we protect them, enough to reshape how we define intelligence. And now we close the loop, back to the beginning, a landscape at dusk. Dust hangs in the air. A family moves slowly, calves in the center, adults around them. The world is wide, and the distance between groups can stretch far enough that a human would feel alone. But elephants are not alone. They have sound, they have contact, they have a channel of connection that humans barely perceive. A low rumble rolls through the land, so low it doesn't announce itself to you, but it reaches them. One elephant stops, one elephant listens, and from the group only one responds, not because she is startled, not because she is guessing, but because the call reaches into her identity. It points to her, it singles her out. It says in the elephant way something like, you, and she answers, and she begins to move. That moment is not a fantasy. It is not a cartoon. It is not Dr. Doolittle. It is the real world, more complex than we were ready to measure. And if we accept what this discovery suggests, then the real transformation is not about elephants changing. It's about humans finally noticing, finally recognizing that other species live inside social worlds with depth and identity, finally realizing that intelligence is not a ladder with humans at the top. It's a landscape filled with many kinds of minds. And when we learn to listen better, that landscape becomes visible, which is why the future can be hopeful, because listening is the first step toward respect, and respect is the first step toward protection. A world that listens is a world that protects. A world that recognizes other minds is a world that treats life with dignity. And elephants, whether we ever translate their calls or not, have already shown us something priceless. They are not just animals moving through space. They are communities. They are memory. They are relationship. They are lives that are known, lives that are remembered, lives that may be called, and an answer rolling back through the earth.